I was just helping my friend's mom with her taxes, then she said, let's go over my private deductions. The afternoon sun filtered through the blinds, casting stripes of light across the living room, painting the small stacks of papers in warm gold. I hadn't expected to be here, yet here I was, crouched over my friend's mom's tax documents, trying to make sense of receipts, statements, and forms that seemed to multiply by the minute. She appeared from the kitchen doorway, carrying a mug of coffee, her presence immediately filling the room in a way that was quietly commanding yet comforting. She was poised, effortless in her movements, each step measured and deliberate. There was a subtle elegance to the way her fingers curled around the handle of the mug, and a gentle smile that reached her eyes, hinting at humor and warmth in equal measure. "Thanks for helping me today," she said, voice soft but confident, the kind that made ordinary words feel personal. I nodded, trying not to linger too long on the warmth in her tone, or the way the light caught her hair as she tucked a stray strand behind her ear. We settled at the dining table, which had been cleared to make room for the paperwork. The scent of coffee mingled with faint traces of vanilla from a candle she had lit earlier. I shuffled through the papers, feeling the rough texture of receipts and the smooth gloss of official statements under my fingertips. She leaned forward slightly, just enough that our knees brushed briefly beneath the table. A spark of awareness ran through me, subtle, but unmistakable. I tried to focus on the numbers, on the task at hand. But my eyes kept catching little details, the delicate line of her collarbone peeking from under her sweater, the soft curve of her smile, the quiet confidence in the tilt of her head as she studied a form. There was a depth there, an unspoken life experience, a sense that she had seen the world and carried both its laughter and its weight with grace. At one point, she handed me a receipt, and our fingers brushed. Just a fleeting touch, but enough to send a subtle warmth up my arm. My heart thumped, not in a rush, but in a quiet recognition that something had shifted. She didn't pull back, her eyes held mine for a moment longer than necessary, and I felt an odd mix of hesitation and curiosity. We spoke in casual tones about mundane things, the difficulties of tax season, a memory she shared about my friend from years ago. Yet beneath the normal conversation, there was an undercurrent, a sense of familiarity building in the small gestures, the way she leaned slightly closer when explaining a detail, the soft laughter that seemed to linger in the room after she spoke, the subtle way her hand rested on the papers, close to mine. By the time we had sorted through the first few pages, I realized that this meeting was not just about taxes. It was about the quiet pull of human connection, the kind that comes unexpectedly and makes the ordinary feel significant. And in that moment, as the sunlight glimmered on the polished wood of the table and the aroma of coffee wrapped around us like a gentle embrace, I understood, I was not just helping her with numbers. I was stepping into a space of warmth, subtle tension, and an unexpected, unspoken bond that neither of us yet knew how to define. The first few receipts had been sorted, the initial tension of unfamiliarity beginning to ease, but the room still held a quiet energy, a subtle awareness that neither of us could ignore. She leaned back in her chair slightly, the soft creak of the cushion under her weight blending with the faint hum of the ceiling fan. I watched the way her fingers traced the edge of a document, idly, almost unconsciously, and felt an unexpected pull, a mixture of admiration and curiosity. "So, how's he been?" she asked, nodding toward my friend. Her tone was casual, yet it carried warmth and genuine interest. I smiled, leaning slightly forward, meeting her eyes. It wasn't just small talk, it was an invitation into a shared space of understanding, a subtle bridge between us. "He's good," I replied. "Busy with work, you know how it is." I shrugged, but she noticed the small tension in my shoulders. There was something about the way she observed, quietly, attentively, that made me want to open up just a little more. We talked about ordinary things at first, the mild chaos of tax season, a quirky anecdote about a neighbor's confusing forms, even a joke about receipts disappearing into thin air. But beneath the casual chatter, the room seemed charged with the kind of energy that comes when two people feel a quiet, growing recognition of each other. Every glance, every subtle gesture, seemed to carry more meaning than it appeared. I caught myself noticing details I hadn't before, the delicate shimmer of her watch in the sunlight, the way she pushed a strand of hair back from her temple with such fluid grace, the softness in her voice when she laughed at a small joke. I realized I was not just listening, I was absorbing her presence, savoring the rhythm of her speech, the faint rise and fall of her breathing as she leaned closer to read a line on a form. At one point, she handed me a pen, and our fingers brushed. It was brief, almost accidental, but it left a trace of warmth lingering in the space between us. I looked up, and our eyes met, hers steady, curious, a faint smile playing on her lips. I smiled back, a small acknowledgement of the unspoken connection. The conversation shifted subtly as she shared a story about my friend, a memory from years ago that painted him in a new light for me. I listened intently, leaning in slightly, drawn by her warmth and the way she spoke with quiet confidence. There was an intimacy here, not of romance yet, but of shared humanity, of trust forming in small, deliberate moments. The afternoon light continued to shift, softening the edges of the room. I became aware of how comfortable it was to sit here with her, how easy it felt to engage without pretension or performance. Every laugh, every shared glance, every subtle touch of hands on documents seemed to weave a quiet tension, one that neither of us named aloud but that simmered beneath the surface. By the time we paused to stretch and refill our coffee mugs, I realized that this was no longer just about taxes. It was about connection, slow, measured, and rich with possibilities. And in that gentle, sunlit room, surrounded by papers and the faint scent of coffee, I began to understand that the day had already shifted, subtly, into something far more meaningful than I had expected. By mid-afternoon, the piles of papers had thinned, yet the energy between us had quietly shifted. We were no longer simply a young man helping a friend's mom with tax documents, the room had contracted into a space of subtle attention, the kind where every movement felt charged with meaning, and every glance carried an unspoken question. She set a stack of receipts to the side and leaned forward, her elbows resting lightly on the table. There was a faint crease in her brow as she studied a form, but her eyes flicked toward me, sharp and playful, as though she had something unsaid to test whether I would notice. I felt a small flutter in my chest, a blend of curiosity and caution. "Let's go over my private deductions," she said, her tone almost teasing, but soft enough that it brushed against the edges of propriety. She didn't need to explain further, the phrasing itself carried a quiet intrigue. My mind hesitated, caught between professionalism and the subtle intimacy that her words implied. As she spoke, I noticed the gentle shift in her posture. She leaned slightly closer, enough that our knees brushed again under the table. It was a minor contact, almost accidental, yet it sent a warmth radiating through me, pulling my attention fully toward her. She didn't seem to notice, or if she did, she didn't mind. Instead, she watched me with that calm, steady gaze that suggested awareness and quiet amusement. I reached for a paper to organize the deductions, and our hands brushed once more. The contact was light, fleeting, but it lingered in my awareness, a small spark that neither of us acknowledged verbally. I swallowed, trying to refocus on the task, but the room felt charged in a way that went beyond numbers. Her presence was magnetic, the subtle scent of her perfume, the soft hum of her voice as she explained a line, the warmth radiating from her as she leaned toward me, all of it made it difficult to concentrate solely on the math. We talked through the deductions, and with each explanation, she would gesture gently, guiding my hand or pointing to a line on the form. Sometimes our fingers brushed, sometimes our elbows grazed. Each contact was innocuous, yet each carried a weight I couldn't ignore. There was a rhythm to the interaction, a delicate interplay of attention and distance, of professional necessity and quietly building intimacy. I found myself noticing the smaller details even more, the soft crease of her sleeve against her wrist, the quiet cadence of her breathing, the faint curve of her smile when she noticed my brief distraction. Her confidence was effortless, yet there was a subtle vulnerability beneath it, a quiet openness that invited me in without words. By the time we finished that section of the paperwork, I realized something had shifted irreversibly. The connection between us was no longer purely practical, it was layered with unspoken tension, curiosity, and a burgeoning awareness of each other in a way that neither of us had anticipated. She had invited me, subtly and carefully, into a more intimate space, not through words alone, but through gestures, glances, and the warmth of proximity. And in that quiet, sunlit room, surrounded by stacks of papers and the faint aroma of coffee, I understood that the day had taken a turn. The private deductions were more than just numbers on a page, they were a subtle invitation into something unspoken, a slow-burn tension that neither of us was yet ready to name but that both of us felt deeply. By now, the room felt smaller, more intimate, even though nothing about it had changed physically. The sunlight had shifted lower, casting a warm, golden glow across the papers and our faces. The faint aroma of coffee lingered in the air, mingling with the subtle scent of her perfume, something soft and understated, a mix of floral and warmth that made the space feel strangely charged. We were deep into her private deductions, reviewing numbers and receipts, yet the focus on the math had become almost secondary to the quiet awareness of each other. Every movement seemed magnified, the way she leaned forward, the tilt of her head as she explained something, the soft exhale she let slip as she studied a particularly confusing form. I felt drawn into every subtle gesture, each one carrying more weight than the last. At one point, she gently guided my hand to point at a line on the form. Her fingers brushed mine in the process. The contact was fleeting, almost accidental, yet it sent a quiet warmth shooting up my arm. I caught myself staring a moment longer than necessary, aware of the pulse in my wrist, the slight rush in my chest. She didn't pull back, instead, her gaze lingered on mine with a soft, unspoken curiosity, a small, knowing smile touching her lips. It wasn't just the physical contact, though that was enough to make my attention waver, but the way she carried herself. Confident, composed, yet subtle hints of vulnerability softened the edges. Her voice, when she spoke, had a musical quality, rising and falling in a rhythm that made even the most mundane tax deduction feel intimate. Each time our eyes met, there was a silent acknowledgement of the tension building between us, a recognition that neither of us would speak aloud just yet. I noticed her leaning a little closer when explaining a complicated line. The proximity sent a subtle jolt through me, but the moment was natural, unforced. Our shoulders brushed lightly, her elbow near mine, and I felt the heat of her presence, not overwhelming, but undeniable. The ordinary act of reviewing numbers became a series of quiet, shared exchanges, a laugh at a confusing entry, a brush of fingers across the paper, a soft glance that lingered just long enough to be felt deeply. There was a rhythm forming between us, one of closeness without crossing boundaries. The slow-burn affection wasn't about declarations or overt gestures, it was in the subtle ways she sought my attention, in the small, careful touches that left an impression long after they occurred. Even sitting across from her, with papers spread between us, I felt a connection deeper than the practical reason we were together. By the end of this session, I realized that the private deductions had become a pretext, a delicate excuse to share proximity, touch, and quiet intimacy. I was acutely aware of every detail, the warmth of her hand, the softness in her gaze, the faint scent that lingered as she leaned closer. And in that moment, I understood that our bond had shifted. What had started as simple assistance had grown into something more profound, subtle, and impossibly delicate, a slow-burn affection that neither of us could name, but that both of us could feel in every touch, glance, and shared breath. The room had settled into a calm rhythm. Papers were stacked neatly, pens resting on the edge of the table, and the sunlight had softened into a gentle amber hue that filled the space with warmth. We were no longer just going over numbers, the conversation had shifted, imperceptibly, into something more personal. The earlier playful tension had matured into a quiet comfort, the kind that comes when two people feel they can truly notice each other without pretense. She leaned back in her chair, her hands loosely folded on her lap, her gaze distant for a moment as though she was gathering thoughts before speaking. I watched the way her fingers fidgeted with the cuff of her sleeve, a subtle, almost unconscious gesture that spoke volumes. It made me realize that beneath her confident exterior, there was a vulnerability she didn't often show, a trust that she was extending to me simply by being present. "I've been worried about a few things lately," she admitted, her voice low and unguarded. It was casual in tone, almost as if she were speaking to herself, yet her eyes met mine with a quiet sincerity that made my heart tighten. I leaned slightly forward, attentive, aware that the usual formal boundaries had softened in this shared space. She spoke of mundane worries at first, bills, deadlines, small frustrations, but gradually the conversation deepened. I noticed the way she exhaled lightly after each confession, the small shifts in her posture, the way her eyes sought mine for acknowledgement. I responded not with grand gestures or advice, but with attentive listening, nodding occasionally, letting silence give space to her words. The act of simply being present, of allowing her to feel heard, seemed to relax her shoulders and brighten the faint crease in her brow. At one point, I offered a subtle gesture of reassurance. My hand lightly brushed hers as I handed over a pen. The contact was minimal, yet deliberate, a small anchor in a moment that carried more emotional weight than either of us admitted. She didn't pull away, instead, her fingers lingered briefly, just enough to confirm a quiet trust between us. It was intimate, but entirely safe, and the warmth of that connection filled the space between us. I became acutely aware of the little things, the soft inflection of her voice, the slight tilt of her head when she confided something personal, the way her hair fell naturally around her face, framing her expression. Each detail drew me further in, not with desire, but with admiration and care. There was a rare openness in her that invited a corresponding honesty in me, a shared acknowledgement of human fragility that deepened our bond. By the time we paused, the numbers and forms had become secondary. The quiet intimacy of the moment, the shared glances, the soft brush of hands, the gentle awareness of each other's presence, had created a connection that transcended the practical purpose of the afternoon. I realized that this bond was no longer about help or obligation, it was about trust, attentiveness, and the subtle closeness that grows when one person allows another to see their vulnerability. In that soft amber light, surrounded by the quiet hum of the room and the lingering scent of coffee, I understood that what had begun as a simple favor had evolved into a delicate, profound intimacy. And in that shared, unspoken understanding, the slow-burn tension between us deepened, balanced now by mutual respect, empathy, and the quiet, magnetic pull of human connection. The afternoon was slipping into early evening, the sunlight now a gentle, golden hue that softened the edges of the room and cast long shadows across the table. The air had grown still, almost expectant, as though it too was holding its breath, waiting for something unspoken to surface. The papers had been mostly organized, yet the atmosphere between us was far from businesslike. It carried a quiet tension, a shared recognition that neither of us wanted to name yet could not ignore. We laughed together over a small mistake, a misplaced receipt that had turned a deduction into a minor confusion. Her laugh was soft, warm, and melodic, filling the space with a rare ease. I noticed how her eyes sparkled with amusement, the subtle curve of her smile making the world outside the room fade into insignificance. For a moment, I felt suspended in that laughter, acutely aware of her presence, of the gentle warmth radiating from her, and of the magnetic pull I could no longer pretend to overlook. Our hands brushed again as we reached for the same document. It was a brief, innocent contact, yet it felt charged, as though the air itself had shifted around the touch. Neither of us pulled back immediately, instead, our fingers lingered in proximity for a heartbeat longer than necessary. I caught her glance, steady, soft, and entirely intentional, and felt a quiet jolt in my chest. There was an unspoken understanding passing between us, subtle but undeniable, a mutual acknowledgement of the tension that had been quietly building for hours. The conversation drifted naturally, effortless now, no longer about numbers or taxes but about life, memories, and small stories that revealed the edges of who we were. I found myself leaning slightly closer when she spoke, drawn not just to her words but to the cadence of her voice, the warmth of her expression, the nuanced movements that spoke volumes. She, in turn, seemed equally aware, her posture open, her gestures gentle, her gaze often settling on me with a quiet attentiveness that felt intimate without needing to be labeled. Even small movements, the brush of her sleeve against mine, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the tilt of her head as she considered a question, carried a weight that made the mundane feel profound. There was a rhythm forming between us, subtle, measured, and charged with quiet longing. Every glance, every soft gesture, Every shared laugh was a brushstroke in a portrait of connection neither of us had consciously painted but both could see emerging. By the time the final papers were stacked and the last figures checked, it was clear that something had shifted irreversibly. We were no longer just helper and friend's mom, we were two people caught in a delicate, slow-burning awareness of each other. The room seemed smaller, warmer, charged with a tension that was both thrilling and comforting. We shared a quiet moment of stillness, sitting across from each other, the soft hum of the room our only accompaniment. I felt her presence fully, the warmth of her hand brushing mine as she reached for a pen, the subtle scent of her perfume, the steady rhythm of her breathing. And I knew she felt it too, the pull, the intrigue, the magnetic closeness that had quietly woven itself into every gesture, every glance, every laugh. In that shared awareness, the slow-burn tension reached its peak, balanced delicately with trust, respect, and a profound sense of connection. There were no words needed, the room, the light, and our mutual recognition spoke everything. The last rays of sunlight slanted through the blinds, bathing the room in a warm, golden glow. The papers had been neatly stacked, the last figures double-checked, and the task that had brought us together now complete. Yet the completion of the work felt secondary to the quiet intimacy that had grown in the room over the past hours. There was a gentle ease between us, an unspoken acknowledgement that something subtle, profound, and deeply human had blossomed. She leaned back slightly in her chair, stretching just enough to release the tension from the afternoon. Her eyes found mine, warm and calm, and for a moment, there was a pause, a shared recognition of all that had passed since I first arrived. I felt the faint warmth of our earlier touches lingering in my awareness, the brush of our hands over papers, the near kisses of elbows under the table, the quiet moments when our gazes held longer than necessary. All of it had coalesced into a delicate connection, rich with trust and unspoken affection. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet sincerity. "I don't know if I could have managed all this without your help." Her words were simple, yet the way she spoke them, eyes steady on mine, fingers brushing lightly against the edge of a form, conveyed far more than mere gratitude. I nodded, meeting her gaze, feeling a swell of warmth in my chest. We lingered at the table, neither of us rushing to leave the shared space. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the fan and the faint creak of the chairs. I noticed the small details I had come to cherish over the afternoon, the curve of her smile when she glanced at a document, the soft rustle of her hair as she tucked it behind her ear, the subtle scent of coffee and her perfume that seemed to wrap around us like a gentle embrace. As I prepared to stand, she reached out and placed a hand briefly on mine, a gesture that was both grounding and intimate. It wasn't a declaration, it wasn't even a promise. But in that brief touch, there was everything, trust, acknowledgement, and the quiet comfort of two people who had shared a moment that transcended the practical purpose of the afternoon. My heart thumped softly, a steady rhythm that matched the quiet warmth radiating from her. We exchanged a final smile, the kind that carries a world of unspoken words. I realized that the connection we had formed wasn't dependent on grand gestures or explicit declarations. It was in the lingering glances, the careful touches, the shared silences, and the gentle acknowledgement of each other's presence. It was slow, measured, and profoundly human, a rare intimacy that neither of us had anticipated but both had come to value deeply. By the time I left the house, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting a soft, amber glow across the quiet street. I felt an unexpected lightness in my chest, a warmth that lingered long after I stepped outside. What had started as a simple favor, helping with taxes, had evolved into a shared experience of trust, subtle affection, and emotional closeness. And though the day had ended, the quiet connection we had built remained, tangible in memory, in glances, and in the small, intimate ways we had allowed ourselves to notice each other. There was no rush, no overt declaration, just the profound, enduring warmth of two hearts that had met in a space of quiet understanding, and in that, there was a kind of perfection. If you felt the tension and warmth in this story, don't miss the full journey. Click the link in the description to watch the long version and experience every moment of their slow burn connection.